You've probably heard people say that you should always pay cash for a car. And then you've also probably heard some people say you should always lease a car. So which is it? Well, they're both wrong. And today we're going to talk about why. This video could potentially save you thousands of dollars on your next car. Indeed, I'll give you an example from real life where I saved $9,000, or at least that. And you'll also learn some cool stuff about economics too along the way. First, a clarification. This video assumes you've already decided on what car you'd like to buy and that you can't be persuaded out of it. You already know what you want. Of course, you'll save money by buying, say, a car used or buying a cheaper model like an economy car over a luxury car. But you already know that. In 1985, Franco, Modigliani, and Merton won the Nobel Prize in economics for showing that how you finance something under certain conditions doesn't really matter. They mathematically proved that your decision under certain conditions is in fact irrelevant. This idea is known as the capital structure irrelevance theorem, and it is the most fundamental theory in all of finance. It is the financial equivalent of Galileo discovering that if you say drop a hammer and a bag of feathers, they will fall at the same rate without air resistance, and that the air resistance merely provides an illusion that they'll fall at a different rate. But without air resistance, they'll fall at the same rate. And this was actually discovered or definitively proven, you will say, by the Apollo astronauts during the moon program.
How about that? It proves that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings.
If you want to understand why Modigliani and Miller came to this counterintuitive conclusion, as well as if you're a business student trying to get your hands around Modigliani-Miller, pay attention to this next session. Whereas if you just want to know the practical implications for buying your next car, just look at the timestamp on the video, and I'll tell you where to skip to. So with that, fundamentally there are only two ways in the known universe to buy anything: debt and equity. That's it. There are no other ways. Even things that appear like they're not, like cash, is actually equity. Cash is actually equity. And similarly, leasing, regardless of what the lawyers say, is actually a form of debt. It's just a differently way structured form of debt, and it's a legal fiction that it's not debt, but believe me, it's debt. Now, when you or a company pay for something in equity, what you're really paying for is it in cash. Cash is simply a form of equity. The advantage to paying with equity is that, you know, in the context of a car, it can never be repossessed. It is yours. But there is a downside to equity, and that is you cannot reinvest the money into something else. It's locked into the car. By contrast, if you were to buy the car through a traditionally structured bank loan or through a lease, you could invest the money that you don't need to put down elsewhere in like a diversified portfolio of stocks or of high yield junk bonds, and probably earn a higher return than the interest rate on the loan or on the lease, assuming you have a fairly decent credit score. The disadvantage there, of course, is that if you miss a payment, you could potentially go bankrupt or the car will be repossessed. Now, in addition with debt, if your car appreciates at all in value, of course your return will be magnified versus the capital you put down. But if not, but if the car goes down in value, which is far more likely than it appreciate, it also means your loss is magnified. What Modigliani and Miller showed is that with any investment, and yes, your car is an investment insofar as it allows you to, say, travel to a job, a higher paying job than you would ordinarily be able to get. is that these advantages and disadvantages of each basically cancel each other out under the assumptions that economists oftentimes function under, such as a perfectly efficient and fair capitalist economy. Now, you're probably saying, but Chris, we don't live in a world with a perfectly fair and efficient capitalist economy, nor do we live in a world without taxes. And that is precisely the point. That is precisely the point.
That is precisely the idea, General. That is precisely the idea.
Modigliani Miller is important because it gives us the conditions unto which your decision becomes irrelevant. So to the extent that real world conditions differ from that, that tells you the criteria unto which you should finance something. Let me repeat that. Modigliani Miller gives us the conditions unto which your decision becomes irrelevant. So to the extent in the real world things differ from that ideal, that tells you how your financing decision should be made. And let me give you, an example from the outside world here that you've probably heard. You've probably heard that private equity companies, lever companies up with a lot of debt when they buy them, meaning they finance the company primarily through debt. And the reason they do that is that an assumption of Modigliani Miller is violated in the real world, and that is that corporate taxes, that is that interest payments on corporate debt are tax deductible for the corporation. Now, this is an assumption that is not in Modigliani Miller. And what this tells corporations is that all else equal, they should finance with debt rather than equity. And that's why we see companies such as the airlines repurchasing shares or borrowing money and then repurchasing shares, effectively moving their capital structure more towards debt. So these companies, in doing this, and it's a very controversial thing, are simply responding to what finance theory says in the context of the fact that taxes exist in the real world. And they're doing it really to minimize their tax bill, and in doing so, minimize their cost of capital. Keep in mind, economists generally agree that making any form of interest tax deductible doesn't really make much sense. But every tax code in the world that I can think of, and let me know if you know one that's not this way in the comments. Every tax code I can think of in the world allows a company to deduct corporate debt, interest expense. So what we've seen is that taxes are one thing to consider when you're trying to figure out how to finance something, which is why a corporation, all else equal, will oftentimes buy a car or lease a car using debt, because the tax code incentivizes them to do so. Now, unfortunately for us mere mortals, interest on car payments is not tax deductible, and therefore that is not a consideration. So then how do you decide how to finance a car from there? Well, what is something you can consider is that a car company's own internal bank, what's known as its captive finance company, oftentimes makes stupid decisions and will allow you to finance something in an artificially cheap way. And the reason why they do this is because if you're trying to sell cars, it makes sense to make the financing cheap versus offering, say, $5,000 off the car. The reason is that if you list the lease price, if you list the purchase price of the car low, if you lower it, you're essentially hurting the prestige of your brand. So it makes sense if you're trying to sell cars to offer, say, an unusually good financing deal to sell the cars as opposed to simply discounting them. But anyway, these discounts essentially violate a condition of Modigliani Miller, and thus you should take advantage of them if you can. i.e., if a car company offers 0% APR on a car, all else equal, that is probably your best way to finance it, because 0% is probably cheaper than they should be borrowing, lending to you given the risk involved. But they're doing that as a way of discounting the car, and therefore you're not getting the full discount on the car if you don't take advantage of that. But if you're a person who dogmatically insists on paying cash for the car, Modigliani Miller basically tells you that you're wrong, because there is no intrinsically correct or incorrect way to finance a car, all else equal. So to the extent things aren't equal, and in this case the interest rate is artificially low, you should take advantage of that. Just the key is just don't use the cheap financing to buy more car than you would ordinarily do so, which is oftentimes why the car companies do it, but don't fall for that. Don't use the cheap financing to buy a more expensive car than you otherwise would. Now, what about leasing? As I said, leasing is a form of debt, but it's a different way structured form of debt. And leasing generally makes sense when the car company is expecting the car to depreciate less than it actually will, or is likely to do so. If you look in the fine print of any lease offer, online or in a car lease, what you'll see is something called the residual value. That is what the car company expects the car to be worth at the end of your lease. And when you lease a car, you're essentially paying the difference between the list price of the car, and yes, you are buying the car, so there is a overall price for why you're buying the car in the lease offer, regardless of what you think. And when you lease a car, you're paying the difference between the purchase price of the car and what it will be worth, or what the car company thinks it will be worth when you turn in the car. And you're paying that difference in monthly payments or with a down payment and with some interest attached. So to the extent the interest rate is artificially low, i.e. they're lending to you at a lower rate than what your risk would actually be, and to the extent that they're assuming the car is going to be worth more than it actually is, that is when you should lease. And let me give you an example from my life. So as you can see, when you lease a car, you're fundamentally making a bet on how much the car will be worth. If the car is going to be worth less than what the car company thinks, then generally you want to think about leasing, assuming the interest rate isn't very high. So let me give you a real-world example. Back in 2012, I leased a Nissan Leaf electric vehicle. And Nissan had the list price of the car as $38,000. But despite that list price, it was the cheapest car that I've ever bought. And the reason was because of the financing deal I got on it. Basically, the federal government at that time, and I believe it's still the case, was giving a $7,500 tax credit on buying an electric vehicle. Now, I wasn't expecting on having $7,500 worth of tax liability at the end of the year, and therefore I wouldn't get the full value of that. But if I leased the car, Nissan's bank would get that $7,500, and they effectively viewed that as a down payment on the car lease. And this effectively knocked down the price of the car to $30,500 or around there. But here's the kicker. On a 2-year lease, Nissan had the residual value set at $24,000, meaning they were assuming the car, a piece of consumer electronics, would only depreciate $6,500 in 2 years. And that seemed insane to me. And then coupled with that, the interest rate on the lease was something like 0.004% or something insane like that. So my monthly payment ended up being about $270 a month with no money down on a $38,000 car. Now, it turned out, as I was expecting, Nissan did greatly overprice the car. In 2 years, the car ended up being worth about $15,000 versus the $6,500 in depreciation that I actually paid for with the lease. So overall, leasing saved me about $9,000. Whereas if I had dogmatically insisted on paying cash for the car or financing through some loan with a higher interest rate, I would have had to pay, $9,000 or more in depreciation. So I effectively saved $9,000 by taking advantage of the lease offer. Now, this doesn't mean, though, you should always lease a car if the lease offer is bad. So, for instance, with my next car, which was a Mazda Miata, the ND model, I ended up not leasing it because the interest rate on lease was something like 5.5%, and the car company set a very reasonable residual value. So therefore, I wasn't getting much of a deal with it. It didn't make sense to do it. It made sense to pay cash or do a traditional loan, and I believe I did a traditional loan at like a 2% interest rate or something. So what I hope to have shown is that there is no intrinsically better way to finance a car. It all depends on the terms of the deal as well as your risk tolerance. Okay? So when people insist that you must lease a car or that you must pay cash for a car, they're wrong, and they could be costing you a lot of money. Just don't use cheap financing to buy more car than you otherwise would. I hope you found this helpful. If you have, please like or subscribe, and please let me know, in the comments what you think of this video, and if there's anything else I could have touched upon, or if you have any interesting financing stories about buying a car. And with that, thank you.